How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my fourth video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the second section of Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics, titled General Principles. Last time, we learned about the distinction between external and internal elements of linguistics, whilst examining writing, phonology, and the differences between speech and language along the way. Quite excited for this episode because it's here that we'll actually dive deeper into science. This part of the book is quite a bit shorter than the introduction, so you should be able to knock it out all in one video, although I do warn it's going to be a bit of a long one. In terms of the section itself, it's made up of 3 chapters. Firstly, nature of a linguistic sign, then immutability and mutability of a sign, and finally, but not at all leastly, static and evolutionary linguistics. Nature of a sign is split into 3 sections, the first defining signs and the rest examining the principles that Saussure sees as defining them. It begins with this first section, called signs, signifier, and signified, by lamenting the fact that some people regard language as simply being a naming process, where there's a list of words and a list of concepts interconnected. This model fails in several different ways, however. As Saussure says,
it assumes ready-made ideas exist before words. It doesn't tell us whether a name is vocal or psychological in nature. Finally, it lets us assume that the linking of a name and a thing is a very simple operation, an assumption that is anything but true.
In his eyes, this view is naive. He emphasizes the fact that the units which make up signs are psychological in nature and bound together associatively. Like we talked about in an earlier video, signs are composed of sound images and concepts, with the former not being sound itself, but rather the psychological imprint of it, essentially the impressions it makes on our senses. The psychological nature of signs is, as Saussure says, evidenced by how we can talk to ourselves in our minds. We are able to use sound images in our heads without actually making a noise. It goes on to describe how sound images and concepts are intimately connected, each one being able to recall the other, as he shows with the arrows in this diagram. Ending the section, he points out that there is something of a terminology problem. The terms concept and sound image are slightly misleading, at least without further thought. The problem mainly rests in the fact that people often confuse the sound image with the sign as a whole. His solution to this ambiguity is to rename the parts that make up signs to signifier, the sound image, and signified, the concept. This shift in terminology makes it so the relationship between the two is a bit more clear-cut. Ending the section, he says that his goal with this chapter is to outline the 2 primordial characteristics of signs. The first is that the sign is arbitrary, or to put it in better words, the association between signifier and signified is arbitrary. There's no reason why the sounds s and stir should mean the concept of a female sibling. There's no real intrinsic relationship between the two. He goes on to attack the idea that symbol is a synonym for signifier. The reason why is that a symbol is never arbitrary in the same way that a signifier is. By its nature, symbols reflect the signified. This example is the scales that represent justice. That symbol can't be replaced by any old thing, like a chariot. It's symbolic of the equality that serves as a pole of justice. Returning back to the characteristic itself, that the signifier-signified relationship is arbitrary, Saussure reflects on his choice of wording. When he says arbitrary, he doesn't mean that it's up to the individual to choose whatever signifier they want. Instead, he says this.
I mean that it's unmotivated, i.e. arbitrary, in that it actually has no natural connection with the signified.
He ends the section by outlining 2 possible critiques of this rule of arbitrariness. The first being the existence of onomatopoeia, and the second being that of interjections. On the point of onomatopoeia, he argues that they too are arbitrary, insofar as they are only approximations of original sound. Think of the difference between different languages, like woof woof in English and oua oua in French for dog barking. Additionally, just like any other sign, they are subject to evolution, like the word pigeon from the Vulgar Latin onomatopoeia pipio. In terms of interjections, the same count as work. For example, an English person might say ouch, a French person says I. In addition, many interjections originally came from other words, like mort Dieu in French, coming from words meaning God's death. Now that it has been shown to be arbitrary, Saussure turns his attention to the second primordial characteristic of a sign, its linear nature. Essentially, since signifiers are auditory, they are released in a straight line through time. They thus form something of a chain, which becomes more obvious in writing where the line of letters replaces the line of time that exists in speaking. Now, the first chapter is out of the way. It is time for chapter 2, Immutability and Mutability of a sign. Here, Saussure is most interested in moving away from the notion of language being a social construct that he built up in the introduction, instead looking at it as something that is tolerated, not consensually agreed upon by the community. It is split into two parts, the first looking at the immutable characteristic of language, the second at the mutable ones, hence the title. He starts the first section by outlining his goal, to show why we can't control signs. To begin with, at any point in time, language is seen as being inherited from a preceding era. In his words,
no society, in fact, knows or has ever known language other than as a product inherited from preceding generations, and one to be accepted as such.
This is why Saussure sees the question of the origin of language as pointless. A particular state of language is always nothing more than the result of history. However, he points out that just knowing that language is always inherited doesn't really explain anything. The reason why is that inherited laws can be changed. It's not like traditions are static, after all. This is where he goes back to language as a social institution, asking the question of what makes language special. Saussure states that there are a multitude of different ways of approaching the core problem, such as the fact that every era contains people of all different ages, so there isn't really any linear succession of generation after generation. Additionally, he says, it can be argued that the vast majority of people aren't consciously aware of the rules of language, and thus can't change anything about them. However, he counters that even those who are aware aren't capable. In his eyes, these approaches are important, but not necessarily topical. For this reason, he lists 4 other reasons he sees as more valid. Firstly, there's the arbitrary nature of a sign. This is because you need to have a basis of some sort to discuss just how to change things. The example he gives is of marriage, where it's possible to discuss the pros and cons of polygamy versus monogamy. Points can be put forward on both sides. However, it's more complicated when it comes to signs. They are completely arbitrary, as Saussure has already demonstrated. Thus, how can one go about discussing change? Why prioritize the sounds sis and stir over something else or the signified of a female sibling? The very nature of a sign wards off change. Secondly, he says, is the fact that there is a multiplicity of signs necessary to form any language. There are so many signs that it's simply impractical for language to change in any large fashion. Pentultimately, change is slowed down by the overcomplexity of a system. I think this is best explained by Saussure himself.
The system is a complex mechanism that can be grasped only through reflection. The very ones who use it daily are ignorant of it.
He goes on to reiterate again that even those who specialize in language, like grammarians and linguists, have failed in meddling with it itself. The final point he gives us is on the collective inertia towards innovation. Essentially, language is spread throughout everyone. Other institutions and rights, such as that of marriage, can involve only a few people at one time. Not language, though. Language is always everyone's concern. It is combined with society, what Saussure refers to as a prime conservative force. Language is constantly being influenced by all its members, but a revolution of just a few individuals is impossible. Concluding this section, he states that it is again important to stress that more than just the social forces, language is also a product of time and thus connected to tradition. This brings us to language's mutability, particularly how time affects it. It might seem a bit contradictory at first, since he just explained how it's hard to change language. But, as an editor's footnote explains, he wanted only to emphasize the fact that language changes in spite of the inability of speakers to do it. One can also say that it's intangible, but not unchangeable. Very important to Saussure's view is the fact that no matter what force of changes, there's a shift in relationship between signifier and signified. He gives a multitude of different examples of this, beginning with, and apologies for my pronunciation, the evolution of the Latin necare, meaning kill, into the French noyer, meaning drown. Both parts of the sign, the signifier and the signified, changed. Thus, Saussure says it would be pointless to separate them from each other. The same process occurs with all other words, although in different ways. For example, an Old German word for 1/3 might have its signifier change in how it works grammatically, whilst the signifier stays the same, or the Anglo-Saxon plural for foot changes drastically as English evolves, different correspondences between phonetic substance of the signifier and the signified emerging. Summarizing, he says,
Language is radically powerless to defend itself against the forces which from one moment to the next are shifting the relationship between the signified and the signifier.
Continuing, he outlines how language differs from other human institutions. For example, whilst things like customs and clothing are all based, to some degree, on the natural relations of things, such as the human form in the case of the latter, language is unique in that it's fully arbitrary, where any signified can be attached to any signifier. He returns back to the American linguist William Dwight Whitney, who was one of the first to theorize language as a social institution. Saussure both praises and critiques Whitney, on the one hand lauding him as one of the first people to fully recognize the sign as arbitrary, but also being critical of him for not seeing how that arbitrariness sets language apart from other institutions. The fact of the matter is that language is a product of both social and temporal elements, and as such no one person can change it. Yet its arbitrary nature theoretically allows for any relationship between signifier and signified. The two elements that make up signs are free to a degree not encountered anywhere else, and consequently evolution is inevitable. This is true too of conlangs. Saussure says, Esperanto, for example, is only free from mutability whilst in the hands of its creator. As soon as it enters into the world properly and becomes the property of everyone, it begins evolving. Ending the chapter, he lists 3 points that he seeks to connect to the introduction. Firstly, there is the difference between speaking and language itself, something that we have gone over thoroughly in the last 2 episodes, which can be summed up by saying that language is something of a collective depository of signifiers and signifieds, while speaking is a concrete use of language that's too nebulous to study in itself. This brings us to a second point, that language requires a speaking community. Languages, to Saussure, never exist apart from the social fact, a necessary feature of any semiological system. It's thus that Saussure sees language's social nature as an internal rather than external characteristic. He gives this diagram to represent that fact. However, this is a bit limited, since it ignores that language is as historical as it is social. Turning now to the third and final point, he underlines once again that the sign is arbitrary. He ends the chapter by describing how language is only able to evolve through both time and the community of speakers, using this graphic to demonstrate their interrelationship. Both are needed for evolution. The one can't do anything without the other. This concludes chapter 2 and takes us to chapter 3, Static and Evolutionary Linguistics. This is the largest chapter in the section, broken down into 9 subchapters. It begins with individuality of all sciences concerned with values. The main focus of the section is to explain why linguistics as a discipline should be split into 2, static linguistics and evolutionary linguistics. The example he offers of disciplines being split up is political economy and economic history, saying that in both cases it's a question of values, labor and wages in economics, and signify and signified in linguistics. Saussure goes on to say that in all sciences, a distinction should be made between what he calls the axis of simultaneities, shown as AB on the graph, and the axis of succession, represented by CD. The first deals with values themselves, signifiers and signifieds in linguistics, whilst the second deals with values as they relate to time. For Saussure, this distinction is of the utmost importance, as, in his words,
Language is a system of pure values which are determined by nothing except the momentary arrangement of its terms.
Additionally, engaging with these 2 axes is all the more important because of the complexity of language. Because of how multiplicitous and nebulous the system of signs are, all precise and rigidly interdependent, it is impossible to study both language's succession and simultaneities at the same time. It's for this reason that Saussure believes in separating out the discipline. To this end, he proposes 2 ways of referring to these fields. The first he puts forward is evolutionary linguistics and static linguistics, as the title suggests, the former dealing with how time influences language, while the latter is focused on language states, specific points in a language's evolution. The second way he refers to the 2 fields is by the names synchronic and diachronic linguistics, the hopes of using a more precise vocab. Because of how important these 2 terms are to Saussure, it be well worth it to take a step back and look at what they mean. Diachronic comes from the ancient Greek prefix dia, meaning through, and the word chronos, meaning time. Thus it means through time. It's much the same with synchronic, but with syn meaning with, so that it refers to being with time. To Saussure, synchrony refers to specific language states, or rather, specific points in time of a language's development, whilst diachrony refers to the change of signs over time. This brings us to the second section of the chapter, Inner Duality and the History of Linguistics. He begins by laying out the reasons why synchrony and diachrony should be kept apart. Time for the average speaker doesn't exist, at least in the case of language. We aren't really conscious of how language changes over time. We're only really familiar with a certain synchronic language state. Thus he says that all a diachronic view can do is mislead the linguist, that is, unless they seek to document shifts in language. Saussure critiques the fact that linguistics has historically been completely engulfed by diachrony. Remember from first episodes, linguistics originated from a philological study of proto-languages, like Proto-Indo-European. The problem isn't necessarily that diachrony plays a role in their analyses, but rather that there's an awkward combination between diachrony and synchrony, where language states just sort of drift in and out of view. Summing up his opinion on this form of linguistics, Saussure says,
"Such is the tendency introduced by Franz Bopp. His conception of language is therefore hybrid and hesitating."
Interestingly, despite quite heavily criticizing them in the introduction, Saussure now says that he views the grammarian's viewpoint as being above reproach. These were the people who came before linguistics proper. Their work actually described language states, the horizontal axis being followed faithfully, as Saussure states. However, that isn't to say that their application wasn't deeply flawed. In his words,
"Traditional grammar neglects whole parts of language, such as word formation. It is normative and assumes the role of prescribing rules, not of recording facts."
His final conclusion, though, is that the grammarians at least had a sturdier basis than Bopp and his followers, since the latter were unable to sharply delineate evolution and language states. Saussure ends the section by saying that linguists will have to return to the grammarian's viewpoint in order to be able to get a better understanding of language states. However, he also says that diachrony cannot be ignored. Both have to be studied, just in a way that they don't get all muddled up. This takes us to the third subchapter, Inner Duality illustrated by examples. However, I'm going to skip over most of it, since, as the title suggests, it deals with concrete examples that I don't trust my mouth to pronounce correctly. If you're interested, I recommend finding a PDF online to look deeper into it. It just doesn't really work in a format like this. What I'm going to do for it is simply examine this conclusion, that language is a system whose parts can and must all be considered in their synchronic solidarity. There's no direct connection between diachronic change and synchronic language states. Essentially, this is because change never impacts the system as a whole, only small parts of it. It's for this reason that Saussure states that diachronic facts should be examined externally from language itself. This brings us swiftly to the next section, titled The Difference Between Two Classes Illustrated by Comparisons. The point of this subchapter is to look at both the interdependence and autonomy that characterizes synchrony and diachrony. To put it succinctly, historical facts and language states are closely connected in that the latter is like a projection of language at a certain point in time, but because it's only a moment in time, it's impossible to study a synchronic state diachronically. To illustrate this, Saussure makes a return to chess-based metaphors. The state of a chess set at a given moment is similar to a state of language in his eyes, each piece being similar to signs that they derive their value from their opposition to other pieces. Additionally, the chessboard is always changing through time, but this operation only happens through the movement of one piece by one piece at a time. Using this metaphor, he lists three characteristics of diachronic phenomena as they relate to language. Firstly, just like one piece is moved at a time, change affects only isolated elements of language. Language doesn't just change completely overnight, after all. Secondly, in spite of that fact, the move has an effect on the whole system, one that the player is blind to, at least in the short term, something that can occur in language as well. Finally, each movement of the pieces is completely separate from the state that preceded it and the moves that follow it. In other words, only states matter. Where this metaphor fails, however, is the motivation behind the change. In a game of chess, the players specifically change the board, whilst in language, no such operation takes place. Language is modified spontaneously and fortuitously, as Saussure says, without there really being any want to speak of. As we went over in the first episode, Saussure is deeply opposed to thinking of language as some sort of organism that can desire. He concludes at this section by explaining that diachronic facts cannot be reduced to synchronic system, such as that of languages and signs. Now we have arrived at the fifth section, the two linguistics contrasted according to their methods and principles, which Saussure begins by stating that everywhere the opposition between diachrony and synchrony stands out. To show this, he lists two ways in which their methods differ. To begin with, synchronic linguistics only has one perspective, that of the speaking community, and it's from them that it gathers its data. Diachronic linguistics, on the other hand, has two, retrospective and prospective, the first dealing with looking backwards towards the past, whilst the second follows the course of time. The second difference lies in delimiting the field of each of the two linguistics, in other words, what they focus on. Synchronic linguistics, or idiosynchronic as he offers to give a more precise synonym, is specialized, having as its object the total elements that compose languages and dialects. This is in stark contrast to diachronic linguistics, where the terms it deals with often are from the same language. For example, when the evolution of ancient Greek, Sanskrit, and other such languages are compared through time. Moving on, we get to the sixth subchapter, synchronic and diachronic laws. The question he's asking here is whether or not the facts of language are governed by laws. Defining what he means, he says,
Every social law has two basic characteristics. It is imperative and it is general. It comes in by force and covers all cases, within certain limits of time and place, of course.
In the case of synchrony, it is general but not imperative. This is because, although it is imposed on other individuals in the community through collective use, there isn't really any force that requires anything from the speaker themselves. They can choose to say thou when everyone else says you. It's up to them. Diachrony, on the other hand, is imperative but not general. In Saussure's words, it supposes a dynamic force through which an effect is produced, a thing executed. However, it can't be called a law because it always occurs through accident or on only a minor subsect of the entire system. Diachronic facts are particular, being shifts in a system brought about by events outside of it that don't form any system amongst themselves. Next is the subchapter, is there panchronic viewpoint? Here he's looking at just that. Can language be viewed through a diachronic and synchronic lens at the same time? His answer is a firm no. This is because everything diachronic is in flux, constantly changing, which is completely opposed to synchrony, where everything is at a standstill. Additionally, what they look at is completely different, as has already been discussed. The French word chose, for example, is diachronically opposed to the Latin word causa, from which it derives, whilst it's synchronically opposed to every other word in the French language, at the point being studied. Only the sounds can be studied panchronically, he says, and, as you all know, sounds or signifiers are arbitrary. This takes us swiftly to the penultimate section, consequences of confusing synchrony and diachrony. Here he cites two instances, beginning with this one.
Synchronic truth seems to be the denial of diachronic truth, and one who has a superficial view of things imagines that a choice must be made. This is unnecessary. One truth does not exclude the other.
The example he gives of why diachronic and synchronic value can exist side by side is the French word for spite, which once meant contempt. As he points out, just because a word once had a different meaning in the past, something that's diachronic, doesn't mean that it can't have a different meaning in the synchronic language state. The second instance he looks at is the fact that synchronic truth is so similar to diachronic truth that some people confuse the two or think it's pointless to separate them out. Against this, he shows a myriad of different examples of why this leads to errors. His main criticism is that when you think a sound changes solely through the lens of synchronic equivalences and rules, you miss a large part of the picture. For example, looking at Greek, it may seem okay to say that G became K, as if they changed synchronically between two different language states. However, by doing this, the changes that led to that shift are neglected, or worse, combined with the synchronic. In other words, diachrony, the changes, is confused with synchrony. Finally, we arrive at the end of a chapter, simply titled Conclusions. Here, Saussure remarks that linguistics has reached its second bifurcation. It is again branching off in two. On the one hand, towards diachronic linguistics, and on the other, towards synchronic linguistics. This mirrors the first separation we talked about in the last two episodes, the split into linguistics of speech and linguistics of language. He offers this table to represent just that. In his eyes, speaking is where diachronic change occurs. However, he's adamant that this doesn't mean that diachrony doesn't fall under linguistics proper, since it still has to do with language itself as a social institution. Small idiosyncrasies found in a specific group of individuals slowly becomes accepted by the rest of society through time. It begins with speaking and grows to become a part of language. He ends the section by defining what he means by synchronic and diachronic linguistics.
Synchronic linguistics will be concerned with the logical and psychological relations that bind together coexisting terms and form a system in the collective mind of speakers. Diachronic linguistics, on the contrary, will study relations that bind together successive terms not perceived by the collective mind but substituted for each other without forming a system.
Now, this concludes general principles of Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics. I truly hope you enjoyed or at least learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, please do let me know in the comments so I can do better next time. Next, we'll look at his section on synchronic linguistics, diving deep into the details of what synchrony means. Until next time,